Can I just check that you can hear me okay on the mic? Okay. Hi, everybody. My name, if you're joining us online and haven't seen me yet today, is Reid Slater, and I'm going to be facilitating this session on making the case for social protection in crises. It's called Weathering the Storm, and as part of the basic research programme, I want to start by saying that within basic research, we've talked a lot lately about how there's two storms that we need to weather at the moment. The first is the storm that people affected by crises in various parts of the world are facing. Livelihoods disrupted, millions displaced, death and injury, personal and community trauma. And throughout the conference, we're sharing evidence on how social protection can be effective in helping people weather that storm. But there's another storm too. The storm of aid disruption, of reduction, storm or crisis in international development system itself. And in this section, we're going to focus on that second storm. So in the context of declining development and humanitarian aid, we need to work out how to make the case for investing in social protection in crisis settings. We need to work out who to make that case to. So it's not just a technical challenge for us, it's a far more strategic one. We need to figure out how we, as researchers, work together with policymakers and practitioners so we can enhance and demonstrate results, so we can figure out the best entry points and approaches. And we need to work out how a policy level agreement on the case for social protection can be leveraged into political will and financing. And we need to do that in a context that's constantly changing and where there's more and not less competition for international development resources. So the idea for this session is that we recognise right now that the technocratic solutions we all identify from our research and practices will not be enough. We need to get into higher level bureaucratic processes. We need to think about policy choices. We need to figure out where social protection's positioned in global architecture and in priorities. So we want to have a conversation today about what social protection in crises looks like when we talk about it nearer the top. And what can we do? What are our entry points for making a difference to this conversation? So I'm delighted to introduce a panel of experts that are going to help us to explore this. They're right on the front line of policy, either as policymakers and practitioners themselves, or people who are actively straddling that research policy continuum. We'll start with Valentina Barca, who's a social protection policy specialist with a focus on design and implementation choices. In recent years, she's focused a lot on digitisation and information systems, adaptive and shock responsive programming, including in conflict settings, and voice and accountability mechanisms. So a good technocrat that is increasingly reaching into understanding that bureaucratic policy space. It's quite a technical resume, but the reason that we want Valentina on our panel today is that she's right at the front end of a particular policy process, the high-level panel, and we'll be talking to her about that. Charlotte Bilo is a child poverty and social protection consultant with UNICEF's social policy team, focused on research, advocacy, and interagency coordination. In particular for us, she works on the SPIAC-B working group on linking humanitarian cash assistance and social protection. She's worked at the IPCIG in Brasilia, and again has made those linkages between research and policy. And she has an MA in Poverty and Development from IBS University of Sussex, so welcome back. So on to Charis now. Charis Reid is another IDS alumni. Welcome back too. She leads ILO's work on strengthening and aligning national social protection systems with humanitarian programs in Arab states. She advises country offices in ILO on a wide range of nexus topics in the region and is leading ILO's social protection response in Syria. She previously led the social protection portfolio in Palestine and has worked on institutional strengthening in Bangladesh. And then Victor Ikechukwu Ogharanduku is a social protection, social dialogue and expert and researcher. He focuses on social protection in fragile and conflict and violent settings, especially the contributions of social protection programs to peace building and conflict transformation. And he's been part of a significant FCDO-funded Save the Children implemented program looking at expanding social protection for inclusive development in Nigeria. So again, right in that space where policy starts to really matter. So what are we going to do today? I'm going to have a conversation and a bit of a Q&A and a chat with our guests on the panel about that engagement with policy processes. And then after that, we're going to open up the floor for questions from the audience and from online. So are you ready? Glug of water. So Valentina, we're going to start with you. You don't work for a big development or humanitarian actor, but you are right now right at the front line of policy. Would you like to introduce our audience to the high-level panel? Tell us about why it was established, what it's trying to do. We know there's a meeting this week of the panel. Can you tell us how that's going and what it's like to take part in? Thanks.
Yes, thanks. And it feels kind of weird to be described as a policymaker. Like, so I guess where it started, it's quite hard to pinpoint a date, but let's start from the Conflict Forum, because that's where it really started to take shape. Obviously, the Conflict Forum was the fruit of a whole big process in the background with sort of basic research feeding into it, a lot of the STAAR work feeding into it. But the Conflict Forum is the time when we all came together. And those discussions brought about a huge amount of excitement. We realized that we were all doing this in different ways, kind of with our own institutional hats, but we were working on social protection in conflict. It was happening. There was a lot of learning, a lot of energy, but also a huge amount of frustration in terms of what wasn't happening. And the big problem in the background, obviously, being the lack of commitment, the lack of financing. And then this is despite the fact that we're at the highest peak of conflict that we've seen in the last 30 years, the fact that we know that kind of 72% of the world's extreme poor are in these types of settings, even though they're just 25% of global population, that 80% of displaced people come from conflict-affected settings, etc. We still have social protection critically underfunded. It was quite difficult to actually get our fingers on just the numbers of how underfunded until Sophia came along with the basic research, giving us a ballpark number of about 3.4% of ODA is going to social protection in these settings, and that's 7 times less than is going to health and education, far less than is going to humanitarian assistance. And that's obviously a big problem given the role that we know social protection can be playing. So what was interesting is that at the end of the forum was this Charter for Action. And the Charter for Action was wonderful from some perspectives because it was very energizing. We used an open space technology approach to generate it, little groups working on topics, but it came out as something which was definitely unfinished, unprecise. Each and every one of us was unhappy maybe with exactly what the other groups had written. So while we were very clear in terms of the direction we wanted to go in, every person in the room had different ifs and buts. And it's the ifs and buts that actually kind of make the difference if you want to shift policy. We need to be working on the ifs and the buts. The other thing is that we kind of had a strong feeling that, yes, we were researchers, practitioners in the room. We kind of agreed that we were doing some important things that were shifting practice, but we didn't really have the right ears in terms of the research is, yes, it's coming out, but is it getting to the right people? Is it heard by the right people? So what the high-level panel is an attempt to get to the right ears. And very quickly, this high-level panel was kind of started to be set up, FCDO funded, very rapid process. I'm going to repeat this a few times. And with that comes imperfection, and with that comes frustration, obviously. We basically, a small team, kind of secretariat was set up, and that team started to identify 2 processes happening in parallel. Gabby Smith helped to kind of lead, and I supported a background paper just laying out what are the issues in the background, what are the questions maybe we should be asking if we want to be shifting the narrative, if we want to be really pushing the right levers and hitting the right ears. At the same time, we started identifying who the panelists could be. And I can tell you that was possibly the most frustrating of processes because we had to kind of go through this. On one side, it had to, from a formal perspective, it had to be someone very high up that could be pushing things from the top down. We need to be shifting the architecture, the incentives, and to get the right people isn't easy. And at the same time, we wanted someone that from a substantive perspective could actually believe in the change that we wanted them to be pushing for, that could actually take it on and then kind of move on with it. This needs to live with its own feet once we've finished with the process. So that kind of, and that this all in a very limited amount of time. So people saying, no, actually, I'm not interested. No, why don't you speak to my deputy? No, actually. And that we ended up with an amazing group of people considering this process. But there's, for example, I personally, and I know a lot of you had issues with the massive gender imbalance that we have in the panel, and that is a big issue that I think we should have been more transparent about. We also have an imbalance in terms of representation from civil society organizations, and that's a problem. But it ultimately, just to give you one example, let's take Jeremy Kanindik is one of the panelists. From a formal perspective, he's now the head of Refugees International. We couldn't get someone from a humanitarian organization that's currently, we couldn't have a head of WFP because there were too many vested interests in that. We needed someone slightly on the outside, but in a high enough position and likely to be someone big in the future. We all hope in a kind of revised USAID, he might actually be playing a big role. And from a substantive perspective, he has an amazing understanding of humanitarian space, humanitarian red lines, and kind of where we might want to be going with social protection. That's just one example. Yes, one last minute, sorry. So just, this is, sorry, I did a bit of venting there on the, but having got the right people and having gone through a first panel meeting in May, we further refined the questions that Gabby had initially set out and really kind of brought those to the next level. You've seen those, a lot of you submitted to the open inquiry that we had, the public inquiry. We had almost 80 submissions from you. Some of them were absolutely amazing. A lot of them, like a vast majority of them, were absolutely amazing. I spent a lot of time together with a few of you working on those submissions, bringing them into a kind of quite vast researchy type paper that's looking at the analysis of what are the key answers to the questions, which has then become a policy paper, which Rachel Scott was responsible for developing, and which is now going to the panelists on Friday. And we've already had some pre-consultations with the panelists, just kind of felt them out in terms of do you feel these are the right issues that are coming up? We received an interesting set of pushbacks, and but we'll come to those maybe later. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess one of the things that I've taken away for us researchers in the room is the importance of doing things that might be imperfect but are on time. So let's take that one with us as researchers who are sometimes not very good at
and there
that
were reasons driving the speed as well. We wanted to, for example, to bring the results to the World Social Summit. There's strong reasons guiding that, the importance of the speed.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to move to Charis now. So Charis, in your role at ILO, you've been covering social protection in the MENA region with a particular focus on that space where social protection and humanitarian responses overlap. What can you tell us about how countries in the MENA region are reacting or responding to this new aid environment, the second storm that we find ourselves in? Are people stepping up to cover the gaps? Do you see policy commitments at global levels translating down or not?
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me in this? Yeah. I think that I jumped a few steps already, because my short answer is no, I don't think global policy commitments are trickling down. So I guess my question is why, or what can we do about this? And there were 3 points that I wanted to make today. So firstly, around the need for financial flows to go through the national system. Secondly, the need to look beyond social assistance to social insurance and jobs. And thirdly, the need to work with the grain of politics or geopolitics, with the caveat that these are from my specific experiences and specific types of conflict. And I know there are many very different contexts out there. So on my first point around national financing or financing through national systems, obviously the long-term aim is to increase domestic resources for national systems. But in the short term, with our international financing, I think we need to question why is that not going through national systems in a lot of these cases at the moment. And the best example I can give is Palestine. So the PA national system exists. It has been strengthened extensively by donors. It's robust enough to deliver in Gaza. And the UN and the ministry, the PA ministry together have verified beneficiaries in Gaza. And a financing mechanism exists for donors to fund into this national system. So why is it not being funded? And I think basically it's down to donor interests or political national interests. And so to overcome that, maybe one thing is around us better advocating at the national level for funding to the national system. But I think beyond that, we need to maybe strengthen the evidence that administrative systems remain or bureaucratic systems remain despite regime change. And that's also the case in Syria, is a good recent example of that, where the administration has remained despite the regime change. And I also, kind of on an aside, want to say that we need to put our agency bias or our agency perspectives aside when we are considering this question, because I was in a workshop on Syria social protection last week with senior ministry stakeholders and the UN and the World Bank. And after that workshop, we started discussing how can we initiate social assistance in Syria. And we ended up talking about whether we could go through the UN as the first agency and then handing over to the national system later. And I just wonder, if we were not sitting here from our international agency perspectives, if we were a group of government employees discussing this, would we come up with some other innovations or some other kind of lessons from, say, COVID rapid responses or rapid registrations to implement the national system first, as opposed to something that we transition to later? So that's my first point around financing international systems. My second point around the need to look beyond social assistance in these contexts. So in the MENA region specifically, then unemployment and informality are particularly high. So we end up with this missing middle of social protection floors and informal workers. And again, this came up as a concern in the workshop with the Syrian government. Beyond the lack of financing, they were concerned that as a new government in a fragile context, they can't commit to rolling out social protection programs that they can then not fulfill going forward. So there's this question around sustainability of financing, sustainability of programs. And actually in Syria, the National Social Security Institute has remained despite the crisis over the past decade or more. So the question is, how can we as international actors support this short-term humanitarian cash intervention or short-term social assistance, whilst also strengthening long-term systems from the beginning? And in reflecting on this, I was thinking we often talk about humanitarian cash transfers, creating parallel systems to national social assistance. But actually, I wonder if the focus as well on social assistance is somehow undermining the long-term sustainability of the system, as we're overlooking social insurance and employment interventions at the same time. So that's my second point around social insurance. And then thirdly is the need to go with the grain of politics or geopolitics. So there are examples throughout the region. For instance, in Palestine, the rights-based language just doesn't hold or doesn't stick. Even before the war, people will say, how can you talk about rights in a context of occupation? So you have to instead use other language, say transparency, accountability, non-discrimination, to advocate for the type of programming that you think is appropriate, and then rights-based approaches might come as kind of an outcome of that. And then in Syria, actually, it's slightly different. The government already are really talking about dignity and inclusion and that they want a rights-based system, but they need to convince, that's the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labour, they need to convince the rest of government to invest in social protection. So in that workshop, we were talking about how cash transfers can be a tool for financial inclusion. They can support other government agendas like digitalization or registration. They can provide economic multipliers or that citizen-state linkage. So the Syrian government were actually asking us for evidence from the region or elsewhere to help them advocate for social protection. And my final point, my final example is in forced displacement contexts. So in the MENA region as well, the narrative is shifting to like returns only, which I don't like as a theoretical way, but it makes sense because national governments don't want to end up with the bill when the aid cuts come and refugees stop being covered by aid. So we need to frame our social protection work in ways that align to national government's interests. For instance, increasing the contributory base in Jordan by enrolling refugees into the national system. That will strengthen the financial sustainability of the Jordanian social insurance system. And then as a byproduct, then refugees will also receive better protection. So those were my 3 points. And I just wanted to say as like a concluding or overarching thing that I think this third point around going with the grain of politics or geopolitics is just the most important thing that we can consider. And I want everyone personally I think everything should be rights-based approaches because that's the right thing to do. But that's not the way that the world works. And I learned it more and more when I was based in Palestine previously. So we need to think about the business case for social protection outside of us in the room, and to I guess, even voting populations or governments globally.
Thank you so much. I mean, I guess that latter point is my big takeaway from what you've said, that we as researchers need to learn what language sticks and what language doesn't, right? And adapts the way that we talk about our findings in ways that people are going to understand and catch on to. We've got to find those hooks. We'll move to Charlotte now. So we want to pick up on coordination, right? And particularly coordination between humanitarian and social protection actors, and particularly international actors. Can you tell us about whether there's progress being made on that? And is it, or could it translate into humanitarian actors taking national systems more into account than they currently do? And we're asking you this because as part of your role at SPIAC-B, which is probably the most serious global coordination effort around social protection and humanitarian, especially amongst the big agencies, there's lots of effort going into the production of guidance, the production of tip sheets. Are they getting us on the same page?
Thank you. Also checking if you can hear me well. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks. As Reid was saying, I'm here today in my role as the coordinator of the SPIAC-B working group on linking humanitarian assistance and social protection. And there's actually a couple of the members in the room, so including from WFP, CALP, FAO, Give Directly, probably forgetting some. But yeah, what I wanted to mention today are precisely the common principles that we developed as a group. And I always like to emphasize that this group involves both humanitarian specialists or experts and development/social protection experts who come together, and in this case came together to develop 9 principles that are meant to guide us, right? To guide our work, obviously at international level, but maybe more importantly also at national level. And these 9 principles, it took us almost, I think, over a year to decide on them, or to agree on them. But just the fact that we managed to agree on 9 principles, I think is already a big achievement, and it's a first step. It's because it shows some sort of commitment, right, from these different actors and some shared language that we were able to agree on. So, for example, the common principles, Principle 5 includes, is focused on coordination, on strengthening coordination mechanisms at national level that include both social protection and humanitarian actors, and wherever possible to build on existing structures. But in some cases, maybe we need new groups or fora. But there's also Principle 7, for example, which is about joint planning or joint planning towards strengthening the national social protection system and making it more shock responsive, and thinking also about transition plans. Principle 8 is about how we engage in a more conflict sensitive manner and how we create these linkages, especially in conflict affected settings. And then in addition to this relatively short document, we also developed what we call the tip sheets, which are basically a companion document which provide tips and guidance and examples from other countries and contexts to operationalize these principles at country level. And again, that took another year to develop in a really collaborative process with a lot of smaller groups. But as I said, I think this is only a first step. Obviously, now it's about contextualizing and operationalizing these principles at national level. And in terms of progress, I think we've had actually some good feedback and reception from national groups. We've presented them to a couple of cash working groups, for example, but also regional groups. In Cameroon, for example, a subgroup of the cash working group on linking humanitarian assistance and social protection, they took them and then discussed them in the national context together with government stakeholders. So we're happy to see that in that context, it helped to provide kind of an entry point to bring together these different actors. There are a couple of country examples, but I think actually we have panels. I think there's one tomorrow that will be on Ukraine. Today we heard about Palestine, where there are, I think, despite all the challenges, there are positive or promising practices in terms of coordination and what works. And I think one key takeaway from these country experiences that we need to invest into these groups or mechanisms, into the people. I think someone mentioned it today in Palestine. One of the key factors maybe for the progress that was achieved in the SPIAC-B, well, the subgroup that links the two, were personalities and really committed individuals, which I think is key. But then, and obviously Valentina will talk more about that, and that's what the high-level panel is about. At the more global and the really higher decision-making levels, we also see that we need more incentives. We need, it's not only at CAF working group level, it's at a higher level where we need these incentives also from donors. Maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you. Again, takeaways. I think for me, the challenge, it took a year to develop some of these tip sheets, and the challenges of writing by committee and achieving consensus amongst a group of relatively like-minded people tells us something about the challenges of trying to get there as we move higher up, where some of the differences might become more apparent. We're going to move finally to Victor. So Victor, I think you occupy a fairly unique position. You work with basic research as part of our research team, but in the not so distant past have been deeply involved in a much more policy and operational social protection work as part of SPID. So we've heard a lot about global initiatives from the speakers so far. I wonder whether you can start to tell us a bit more about how some of these things translate and make a difference in Nigeria. Do they impact on practice, on financing? Are these global headwinds of aid making a difference to what happens where you work? Especially in places like northeastern Nigeria, where we have the compounding crises of climate, of conflict and so on. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll start this way. In Nigeria, we say theory is not practice, and practice is not theory. What this simply means is that we sit in a room like this, we discuss, we draw up guidelines, we meet at high-level panels, we have papers written, but the actual thing is down there, like where I work in the community sometimes. What does this mean? What does it actually amount to? Does it really change the policy on the ground? How does it shift it? These are things. But luckily, in my last project with Save the Children SPID, where I had to engage in system strengthening with government officials, policymakers, and even civil society and beneficiaries at the local level. One thing I find interesting is the language. You see, as researchers, we speak a different kind of language. As implementers, we speak a different kind of language. Then how do we bridge this language between we as researchers and those who are actually down there implementing? That's a huge challenge that we all need to start thinking about. And that means, how do we communicate the evidence we generate? In some parts, you'll sit with a policymaker or a lawmaker and you tell him, oh, I have evidence that this works. He looks at you and tells you, how does that further his own interest? Or how does it further his party's interest? Or how does it further his constituency's interest? Now you sit to the Commissioner of Finance and you say, this, I have evidence for this. He says, where is the money going to come from? The government has no money. You sit with the civil society, they say, yes, we want that for the people, but how do we engage the policymaker? What do we tell them? So you see, we're in this conundrum where we have global policies, we have national policies, but actually getting these policies to actually make real shifts, particularly, and when we talk about policy and practice shift, I don't just see government systems changing. What I see is shifts in people's lives, the people who we want to make an impact. If you say cash transfer, humanitarian cash transfer, SPIAC-B gives guidelines. For me, the shift is that it trickles down to that beneficiary and actually changes lives there, or it changes the government system to actually value that life that needs to be changed. So these are the things I think we need to be looking at. We also need to be looking at relationship. Very important. Very often we come with the projectized mentality, the projectized approach, we're speaking all technical. It doesn't actually make sense down there. Even to government, some of these high-level government officials you see, some of the things we say don't make sense to them. I've sat in panels, I've sat with government officials, and someone just told me, Victor, you're just too technical. What does this mean? So over time, I've had to build relationship with policymakers and government officials to get them to even understand and relate to the technical things I say. So, but at the global level, that trust is not there. We're not investing in building. I'll give you a specific case, and this is FCDO. FCDO invested a lot in the CGDP program in Nigeria, moved on to SPIAC. But at a point when the program was actually beginning to have its real impact, it pulled out. So that relationship there became lost. So relationship is very, very key. And I'll just add two more. The capacity to negotiate in this difficult context. Things are not always the way they seem, just like she mentioned. Political economy, the politics could be the system. You have to have the skill to negotiate within government systems. You need to know who to talk to. You need to know what buttons to press. And you need to know what incentives to use. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. I think, again, we're on language, aren't we? And whether we can talk the same language as the very people that we're trying to influence. So another thing I think for us to work on. We're going to open it up to Q&A. Everybody's looking a bit tired. We're in the graveyard shift. And so I will fill in. I've got 100 questions for you guys. But can I go first to online? Are there any questions online?
We do have a question and a comment. I think it's for Charlotte. Jimena asks, are the principles and tip sheets already available in Spanish? We are trying to promote them, but they need to be endorsed in different languages to ensure we can share them with government bodies. And then a comment, from policy to dialogue, we need many champions along the way. Identifying and engaging these champions could be a key strategy to help spread these initiatives more effectively.
Yeah, thank you, Jimena. Perfect timing. And actually, I'll use this to announce that the tip sheet will be available soon in French, thanks to Kalp, Celine, and others who translated them. And I use your request, let's say, to see in our group or anyone who has basically resources available to translate them into Spanish, because unfortunately we've been struggling with that. But yes, our plan is to translate them ideally to Spanish. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There was this point that was a point that was made about the need to identify champions, right? We'll come to it after a round in the room, I think. So I saw a hand up. Yep, do you want to go first? And then Philip at the back, and then Celine.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Daphne. I'm from UNU in Maastricht. And I have a question for Victor, because you brought together a couple of interesting points that I heard, I think, throughout the conference. One of them being political will, that we talk about a lot, and then participation and language. You brought together some interesting points. And my question is around, and social contracts. My question is around, the right to social protection and the technical level at government that, you mentioned don't always understand the technical language. I'm just thinking in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa where social protection is still seen as a handout so many times, and where even, let's say, the population itself doesn't always believe in it. And then we come in with a very technical approach to social protection. How do we then, and like the voting dimensions that play into it, because obviously governments and politicians want to focus their investments to get votes. How do you bring all of that together? How do you create like a broad-based support for social protection among the population, and so that they claim their rights, you know, to social protection? And that, yeah.
Thanks. Can we go to Philip?
Where is Philip?
Hi, Philip Proudfoot. I'm an IDS fellow. So there was a lot of discussion there around the movement between evidence to policy to impact, weathering the storm, all of these concerns that we have. But the person that's not mentioned, or the subject that we might wish to influence that's not mentioned, are publics in the global north. And we have a problem when we're thinking about this storm that's coming, the rise of illiberalism, especially for things like social assistance, because you can see how the narrative will go. Why are we just giving cash to people over there? We're just giving them money. Have we not forgotten that we also need to defend and fight for the space of international development, rather than just having sort of technical conversations where we try to convince donors of particular things? And we forget that donors are not abstractions, donors are governments, and that government has lost its public. And how are we going to start making the case for very effective programming and discussions like we've had today that we know will have impact, but we're losing the global argument, and that's the storm.
And Celine, do you want to pop your hand up, Celine, so people can see you?
Thank you. Just a comment first to complete a bit the excellent presentation for Charlotte. But when you say it's quite long to take a year to develop such a paper, I so disagree. It's about coordination, so it's on top of everything else. We doesn't have any incentive, so it's just passion of the different person coming together and try to work together to produce that. So you have to think about something like 80 organizations trying to have common principle with 1 hour per month to be given, because it's on top of everything else. So no, definitely it was not so so long. It was painful for you as a coordinator, but definitely not so long. And I think it's also the big issue with coordination, and maybe it's that one of the questions is, how do you see that working? Coordination, as you say, it's among different world who speak different language without any incentive. So on top of everything else, most of the person coming to coordination fora, it's on their, because of their passion, but on top of all of their work. And most of the time, coordination is not even part of the job desk of not any of them.
Okay, thanks. Should we come back to the panel? We had the question for you, Victor, about perspectives on social protection in sub-Saharan Africa, and then we'll come back just to the group more broadly for any reactions.
All right.
Take a minute to respond.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So basically, you must understand something when you talk about social protection. First, some groups look at it as a neoliberal Western model that is being brought to Africa to be imposed. There are those who see it, like you said, as a right. But one thing that is missing is that we have not engaged those that actually represent the people. I think I was in one of the session I was this morning, I said something. Where is the civil society in all of this? We're supporting government, we're supporting the UN system, we're supporting this supply. It has never led to any demand. What we need is to support that demand to come out organically. And it's going to be really difficult. But in all of our conversations, we've left the civil society out of it. And that's also part of the technical issues. We're so focused on government systems, like Rachel mentioned, stranded capacity, M&E system, digitalization. We're so focused on all of those things that we forget that we actually want to better the lives of beneficiaries. And that is where civil society, we need to start doing something.
Can I ask you perhaps, Valentina, if you can follow up a little bit, perhaps in a different way, on what Philip was asking about, right? You're not responsible for making the case to the general public, whether that's in the UK because you're working a lot with FCDO, or whether it's in the country where you live or anywhere else. But I wonder if you can tell us, when you're having a conversation with panel members, some of who do face that question of how am I going to talk about this to the general public, what is it, what does that conversation look like? You know, what are the things that high-level bureaucrats say to you, or high-level politicians say to you about within the HLP process? And how is it different from the conversation that you're trying to have upwards? Are they saying things that surprise you? Can you sense the point that Philip was making in the kinds of things that they're preoccupied with?
Yes. So, I mean, to Philip's statement, I would just fully endorse it. Like that is something that we all need to be looking at. It's not, I mean, it goes far beyond the social protection question, but it is a massive kind of elephant in the room in the background. But in terms of what the pushback that I'm getting, as you say, so we've already started presenting. I said we've already had some pre-consultations with the panelists, and I think that the pushbacks we're getting aren't surprising. So no, nothing is surprising me. But as you can expect, the key pushbacks are in terms of, are we really being realistic, given the fact that actually kind of this is what the aid landscape is going to be looking like, and it's only going to get worse? I mean, from their perspective, there's a really dire outlook in terms of this isn't just a short-term blip. This is kind of here to stay, at least kind of for the next chunk of years. So we need to be adapting to that. And that goes back to the point we made at the beginning about protecting the gains. And in fact, there was a lot of pushback on, it sounds like you might be implying that we should be using humanitarian financing to go to social protection. There's absolutely no way that will be happening. We never really we looked at a lot of ways in which financing could be sustained, and kind of but I mean, very strong pushback from that perspective. A lot of please bring as much of the evidence as you can on the affordability angle, the VFM angle, the risk management. It's not just a moral good during doing social protection, the whole rights-based thing. I mean, you said this in the first panel, so quite a few of the panelists kind of really pushing from that perspective. And yes, we've got good evidence on VFM, et cetera, return on investment, but it's not really been systematized. We could be doing better on that, and the public consultation really kind of put a lot of emphasis on that. There was a bit of a please don't preach to us as humanitarians. The more humanitarian-focused panelists were sort of just don't always put yourself on the high ground. And it's true, again, it goes back to language about how we have these conversations. Bashing is just never useful. And this goes to kind of researchers as well. Like if we bash what people are doing who are actually facing incredibly complex decisions with a lot of competing pressures and incentives, we're not really helping them solve those. What we can be doing more and better is putting ourselves in their shoes and kind of understanding why they might not be doing what we think is the optimal solution, and then helping them to be looking at the decision-making and the trade-offs around that. That's much more helpful. And the last thing they're saying is, please, I mean, we've got a new wave of people who care about migrants not coming to us, protecting our kind of security perspectives. Like, if there's any evidence on this, please give it to us. And we've been having a bit of problems with this because the evidence is actually pointing in the opposite direction. Like that's not one of the things we want to be saying with a high-level panel, but they're asking for evidence on these specific issues because they want to be able to say that to the constituents.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we can pick up a bit on the point that was made online about identifying champions, and whether we can link that into something that I'd scribbled down to ask you about. Charlotte, one of the things that we struggle with in basic research is that pathway between really simple messages versus saying something that's complex but reflects the real world and how difficult some of these challenges are. And I think when we're talking, identifying and talking to policy champions, we've got to navigate that line somehow. And I was wondering, given all the negotiation that it takes to produce a tip sheet with 80 different actors. What can you tell us about how to navigate that tug of war? Can you highlight elements of policies and principles that have been relatively easy to navigate, ones that are much more difficult, and talk us through what you think it takes to get that right?
Well, I think first of all, it takes time and patience, as any collaborative process. And if I think about concrete policy areas, I think something that came up at least this morning in the panel that I listened to is sometimes we use terms, frameworks, principles to not to engage, but we don't really unpack them. I mean, humanitarian principles, they've been mentioned this morning, right? Or not engaging with governments in conflict settings. These are big concepts and terms, but if we actually go down to the nitty-gritty, or we see actually there are often ways, right? So it's often about maybe unpacking those and finding some common ground there at least. I think where, at least in theory, I feel like there's a lot of agreement are more operational things like data sharing. Again, in theory, I know in practice it's very difficult. The same I think is for localization. I feel like at least it is a topic that everyone kind of agrees on, but then of course it's more about really applying it to the operationalizing it, right? So these are some of the areas where I think maybe one more where I think we had more difficulties to navigate, or the bigger question are, of course, humanitarian coordination structures are often more formalized and sometimes more rigid. They're more clear also, they're clearer. Whereas social protection coordination structures at national level, they vary a lot, right? From context to context. So bringing these two together and understanding each other, one maybe more rigid, the other one, maybe completely different in one country to the other, also takes time, and I think needs some translation, so to say, between the two.
Mm. And I think that idea links to what Charis has said about working with the grain, right? And where you can avoiding the rigidity. It's interesting, various people in sessions that I've been in have talked about unpacking the laws, the rules, the regulations, so that we stop using them as a kind of smokescreen or an excuse for not doing things. And if we unpack them, we can really find out, is it really against the law to do that in Ukraine or somewhere else? And stop perhaps hiding behind some of those things that we've been using. I'm going to take another round of questions before we close. Is there anything online?
Some questions. I just wanted to say something around champions. It requires investment, time and resources to actually raise champions. So oftentimes, be ready to invest these resources to actually raise these champions. That's a question for all of us.
Thank you. Tina, do you want to pick maximum 3, and then we'll pick 3 in the room, and we'll let each of our panel members pick one to answer.
This is a question from Tope from Nigeria for Victor. Can putting the government in the driving seat for social protection policy and implementation work where NGOs are the major players in the global south? And how do we create a balance and move from just cash transfers being at the centre of the conversation?
Okay, thank you. There's just one online. Okay. The woman in the teal top, person behind her, and then we'll ask Sophia. Can't see anybody else.
Thanks, everybody. My name is Katerina Lena from the University of Bath, and I wanted to pick up on one point that you made, Charis, actually two. The first one being about going with the flow and about looking at what actually works. And you mentioned that point. You mentioned the example of including Syrians into the national social security system in Jordan as sort of one thing where interests collide. Now, this morning I tried to make a case to the opposite effect and to say that this is something that works for the Jordanian government in a situation where this public social security system is severely under financial strain, but it really, really doesn't work for Syrians. And it's turned, for many of them, it's turned from a source of protection or potential protection into a source of threat. So in these kinds of situations where you have alignment, rare alignment between different policy stakeholders, but it really doesn't work for a particular group at risk, what do you do about that? And I think just to widen that, I think that leads to to this point about investing in systems that stay. If we think through the lens of non-nationals, that can be refugees, but it can also be migrant workers who are often very vulnerable. How does this focus on investing in more permanent systems work, or how can that be made to work in situations where people don't know how long they're going to stay and where they don't plan on paying on ever receiving pensions in the country they're in and don't think of themselves in those terms?
Send it back to Rose.
Hi, so I work for WFP and I'm a humanitarian as much as you can be. In this whole discussion between humanitarian and social protection convergence, I apologize, the humanitarians can be extremely stubborn people. But I don't concur that they should be different streams. There was a quote, there was a stat earlier that the World Bank's funding for social protection was around 11 billion or something in a year. WFP's funding alone last year was $11 billion. So if you just think about the optimization of costs of how much humanitarian assistance has, I wonder if we, instead of discussing amongst us as proxies between how should we coordinate with each other, if we were to just agree that what we want in the governments that we work in is we want to create better linkages between our line ministries. So for the social protection, it's the Ministry of Social Affairs or whatever it might be. And for humanitarians, it's usually the DRM, the disaster risk reduction, whatever entities. And if we were just to first agree that these are our line ministries and that whatever work we do should work to build that linkages between them, I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of cost saving. And this goes against to Vincent's question. When you go to governments and you say, let's do this, let's make this shock responsive social protection system, and they say, what's in it for me? Once you agree between the humanitarian and the social protection pillar that we want to create a shock responsive system and that humanitarians have a lot of money, it can actually help make social registries dynamic, because then the DMA can collect data mid-cycle. So there's a lot of opportunities to cost optimize there. But I wonder if that's what we need to force humanitarians to actually do. They should not be doing anything standalone. They should be working with DRM, and that should be connected to social protection.
Okay, thank you. Can we get the mic to Sophia, and that'd be our last question?
Thanks. I'll try and be really brief. I've been fascinated by the discussion around messaging, and I think what social protection is facing is a sort of mini version of what's being faced around defending multilateral solidarity more broadly. And I'd been interested to hear about this sort of link between policy and politics, and thinking about the political campaigns that we have seen work for good or for ill. We know that the political campaigns that work are the ones that promise change. And weathering the storm suggests a sort of a hunkering down and a sort of stasis. And I wonder what thoughts you've been having or what you've tried around a more positive framing of a vision for a future with social protection at its core.
Thank you. So we'll go to Victor for the question about Nigeria, then Charis for the question particularly about Syrian refugees in Jordan, and then we can perhaps get perspectives on the last two questions from Charlotte and Valentina. Okay?
Okay, so, just responding to that question about the move from cash transfers in Nigeria. Funny enough, the people tend to think that social protection is new in Nigeria. It's actually not new. What's actually new in Nigeria is the humanitarian cash transfer. which spurred interest in social assistance. And so everybody now talks about cash transfers or the grant bargainer, but actually there's been a social protection system over the years. It's just not really, it's just worked for the informal sector and every other person left out of it. So for us to move now is what we've been doing in the last couple of years. That is trying to build a system, trying to strengthen the existing structures on ground so that we have a national system. And then we have sub-national systems because of the federating structure in Nigeria. So that's the challenge. And so it's the system strengthening approach that we are trying to use to move away from cash transfers. Thank you.
Charis.
Yes, thank you for the question. You reminded me that I actually wanted to discuss it with a colleague before coming here and I didn't. I'd be happy to link you to her as well after. But I think that the theory makes sense. We all understand these like comprehensive national social protection systems, and then the theory of refugees or migrants also being included all makes sense. I think the case in Jordan where the work permits have led to refugees being indebted to the system is a specific example of things that we need to, of barriers or issues that can come up that we need to see how to address. And in terms of a couple of things to improve the coverage for refugees. So one is ensuring that they have access to more immediate short-term benefits that would be more of interest to them if they're not intending to stay for 15 years, 20 years and get the pension. Things like unemployment insurance or family benefits, work injury is often already included, but these things like unemployment insurance are benefits we can try to introduce in social insurance systems that will provide more immediate support to refugees, and also healthcare actually is lots of other places. And the final thing is to say that the portability of these benefits are important. So if they've been contributing in Jordan, if they can take that back to Syria when they return, which is a big question, then that will help improve their protection.
Thank you. So Charlotte and Valentina, the question about optimization of costs, cost savings, line ministries, or the question about multilateral cooperation challenges, and is our response to just hunker down, or can we do something more positive? Just pick one. Both of you. You don't have to cover it. You don't have to cover both of them. Just
really quickly, just on the line ministries. Definitely, I think there's first of all also a point of understanding, as I was saying earlier, the different line ministries and understanding the national structures. I mean, both that social protection or development actors engage with and the humanitarian. So I think there's, and if you specifically DRM ministries or agencies are key also for building more shock responsive social protection, right? So actually they are also, should coordinate, and there's a point of strengthening obviously the national social protection system or coordination, sorry. But yeah, definitely understanding these, I think, is a first step to strengthen them also. I'll hand over to Valentina.
For the easy one. In 1 minute, I think, I mean, the beauty of those of us working in the social protection sector is in the sense that the vision that was set out for us kind of in the past, the one of progressive realization, is one that we can still be collectively aspiring to, but with that vision really being grounded in an understanding that progressive realization kind of looks across a wide range of different programs, some of which are completely going with a political grain. They might not be what we would have designed kind of perfectly if we'd come from the outside and done things fantastically. Sometimes, in fact, we go a bit too far along in the policy pollination direction. So I would just kind of stay grounded in that progressive realization thinking and kind of use that to kind of as our guiding star, and there's a lot more we can be doing, but that stays for me the kind of the positive ultimate vision.
Thank you very much. I'm going to wrap us up now. We'll have a round of applause for our panelists. And I want to end by thanking the people online for joining us and asking if you'd like to participate in our final thing that we're going to do. You can by posting your answer in the chat. I want to task you all with turning around to the person next to you and telling them, after listening to people talk about the realities of policy processes, what is the one thing that you would tell policymakers that they need to change about how they think about things? And what is the one thing that you'd like them to change about how they do things? So one thing to change about thinking, one thing to change about doing. Talk amongst yourselves, and thank you very much for joining us.